Hello, and welcome to the heart and soul of the 81st Tactical Fighter Wing. My name is Bob Hale. I'm going to be your guide for the next 15 minutes or so on what actually happened here in the 81st TAC Fighter Wing Command Post. The building, and I say buildings plural because both buildings were built in 1979-80. The red brick building next door to the command post was the wing commander's peacetime building. Plush carpeting, fancy chairs, paintings on the wall, and windows. And that's where the wing commander ran the wing during peacetime. Come wartime, they decanted over here to the command post, which is a hardened filtered facility enabling the wing to operate during wartime conditions, including chemical and biological warfare. The building, both buildings were built in 1979-80. Contrary to popular belief, this building wasn't completely staffed 24/7. There's only 2 rooms in the whole building that were 24/7. And I have to preface this now with to remind listeners or watchers that this is pre-digital. This is analog. There were no cell phones, no tablets, no computers. And you need to keep that in the back of your mind as we go through the building. So, the building was built with 3 feet of steel reinforced concrete, and it's also built to what we call overpressured, which meant that when the main door was closed, the building was sealed, and air was sucked in by vents on top of the building, run through chemical and biological filters in the plant room, and dispersed out through the ventilation system. That meant that once you passed through the second decontamination station, you didn't need to wear your gas mask because it was clean filtered air in here. Besides that, you can't really talk on the phone when you got your mask on. Excuse me. So, like I said, the building was overpressured because as the air was being put into the building, it increased the atmospheric pressure 3 or 4 psi greater than whatever the pressure was outside. So when the door was opened, there was a curtain of clean filtered air stopping any chemical or biological agents coming in. That's how we were able to maintain working without masks in here. The only 2 rooms that were 24/7 are next to this battle cab, as we called it, and further down the hallway in what we call the Bentwaters room. The first room was the EA cell, the emergency action cell. That was the go-to point for the wing. Everything went to them, and then they dispersed it out to where it had to go. It was staffed with an officer and an NCO in there at all times, 24/7, 365 days a year. They are the ones that also ran the remote cameras and the remote locking on all the doors coming down the hallway to gain access into the building. They were also the guardians of the 121 war plans, secret and top secret war plans, that were in 5 different safes against the back wall inside. And to protect those plans, on the window frames of each window, there were shotgun racks, and there was a shotgun mounted on each side of the window frames as the last line of defense to protect those wartime plans. The other 24/7 room was the telex room, which is just behind the EA cell. Basically, it was a telex room. If you can remember back to any films you might have seen in the late 70s, early 80s, someone at a console typing away on the 80-character IBM punch card, which then went through and told the computer what to do. That essentially is what happened inside there. They were decoding all the messages coming into the wing into clear text, passing them into the EA cell for distribution, and anything the EA cell generated went to the comms room to be encoded, to sent back to Washington, Ramstein, JCS, whatever it happened to be. This room, which is what we call the battle cab, was used only in peacetime. It was only used for what we call wing stand-up. 0800 every morning, Monday through Friday, the wing commander would leave his palace next door and come over here and mingle with the underlings. And what he did is he got a briefing from his three main deputies. The colonel in charge of the pilots, my boss, the colonel in charge of maintenance, because like I said in the preamble, I was stationed here for 13 years in the 92nd, and then I worked my way. After 5 years on the flight line, I got fed up with working in bank holidays and nights, so I got a day job doing NATO war planning, which meant I used to work downstairs in the operations pit, which we'll talk about later. So this was the maintenance colonel, and this was the supply colonel. And each one of them would give a briefing to the wing commander on what was happening for the day to make sure everybody was on the same sheet of paper. Sometimes we were, and sometimes we weren't, but they would fix it, and they'd press on. It was a half an hour, 45-minute briefing. They finished their coffee, kiss and hug, whatever colonels did, and then leave. So normal peacetime staffing of this whole building, with only 2 rooms operational 24/7, was maybe a dozen people per shift. And that's what we did in peacetime until we went into a wartime scenario. Although the 81st Tactical Fighter Wing maintained a presence here at RAF Bentwaters in USAFE, we had to be prepared to go to war at any possible time. That is when the 81st Tac Fighter Wing Command Post came into actual function. When the F-4D that was stationed here from 1970 to 1979, it had a strategic mission. I'll let you infer what that means because I can't tell you. However, when the F-4 left and the A-10A came in, it had a ground support mission, completely different than a strategic mission. So effectively, the powers that be had to reinvent the wing to make the new A-10s that came here functional. So what they did is they broke the wing into 6 different squadrons, some of which you can see replicated behind me. The 78th and 91st were at Woodbridge, which is about 7 miles from here, part of the 81st TAC Fighter Wing. The 92nd, which is my squadron, the 509th, 510th, and 511th were here at Bentwaters. You might be able to see that each squadron was assigned 20 A-10s. So with 6 squadrons of 20 A-10s each, the wing's mission assignment was 120 A-10s. We were the largest wing in the world. Most wings would have a base, 80 some odd airplanes, maybe a satellite, and a runway. We had 2 bases, 2 runways, 120 airplanes, and 6 satellites, which I'll talk to you about in a second. So, if we had gone to war, our mission was to prep the airplanes here and get out of town into Germany for our wartime tasking. And that's what we called generation. We were generating the airplanes for wartime. And what that meant was downloading the training munitions. This is a 30 millimeter shell that we load in the airplane, and uploading the live stuff that goes boom in the night. Now, to make that happen, we had to make sure that we hit and met all of our NATO taskings in time-wise. So, when the designers built the command post, we're sitting in the battle cab now where the colonels sit and oversee the operations. They designed what was called an operations pit, which we'll talk about in a second, and the catwalk and the generation boards. Each one of those boards, like I said, replicated one of the squadrons that was assigned to the wing. We would track the squadron, the tail number of the airplane, the pilot assigned to that airplane, and all those boxes that you see off to the right are things that have to be done to convert the airplane from peacetime to wartime. But we had to manage that to make sure it all happened. So the operations pit was designed. There's 35 individual consoles down there that replicated or represented a function of the wing. Supply, hospital, transportation, maintenance, operations, security, police. So anything the colonels up here in the battle cab wanted to know, it was pick up the phone, dial down to the hospital, ask how many beds there were, and they would scurry out and get the information. They were a giant information gathering machine. but more importantly, it enabled us to track the status of the airplanes during the generation. In the front row on the right-hand side are two labeled positions. One is maintenance, and that was for the maintenance officer who was in charge of everyone down there on that shift. And the other one is the maintenance liaison position, which was my shop that was called Combat Plans and Mobility, and it was staffed by one of the 6 people that worked for me. That position was electronically connected to another building on the other side of the runway, which was the Deputy Commander for Maintenance Building. In peacetime, it was where the maintenance colonel sat upstairs. He'd watch airplanes come and go. My peacetime office was on the ground floor, but in the bowels of the building was a miniature one of these things. So as the airplanes were being generated on the flight line, there were what we called flight line expediters. It was a senior NCO, usually master or above, in a pickup truck, just driving up and down the taxiway, making sure everything was happening as it should be with the squadron's airplanes. In his passenger seat, there was a Perspex board with the same information that is on those boards here, but also including all the faults that were wrong with the airplane. So as the technicians fixed the airplane, I like to use 218 in the 92nd because that was Colonel Spader's airplane. Say the altimeter was broken. Once that altimeter was fixed, the technician would tell the expediter. He'd take it off his board. The expediter would then radio in to the maintenance operations center, because it was all with the Motorola walkie-talkies at that time. And in the maintenance operations center, there was a senior controller and 6 individual controllers, each with a Perspex board like that, 78th, 91st, 92nd, with all the faults in there. So as the expediter radioed into the maintenance op center, 92nd 218 is crew ready because all the faults have been fixed. That technician would annotate that on his board and then call directly over to the maintenance liaison position and announce 92nd 218 is crew ready. Now, in my previous introductions, I asked you to remember this is pre-Wi-Fi. This is analog. So everybody downstairs and up on the catwalk had to wear headsets, boom mics, and it was hardwired with bungee cords into the junction boxes. It was on what we call a hot mic or an open mic system, which meant everybody could hear everything. Now, to make sure that the colonels got the information, it was posted on what we call the generation boards. As I spoke about earlier, each squadron, 20 airplanes, ticking all the boxes off to the right to convert the airplane from peacetime to wartime. So up on the catwalk, there'd be 3 or 4 people that were assigned to post the information on their assigned squadron board. So as soon as there was a break in traffic, the maintenance controller would announce 92nd 218 is crew ready. Across on the right-hand side of 218's airplane, there's a box that says CR. And whoever was assigned to post, say, the 92nd board, get a pair of steps, because I know 218 is top airplane, they'd find that box that said CR and put a white cross in it with a white chronograph marker. That's as high-tech as it got. There was no flashing lights, no bells and whistles. Like I said, we tick all the boxes. Once that happened, the command post liaison, which is the operations person, would then notify the squadron that 218 and 615, as an example, were crew ready because the A-10 always flew in pairs unless it was for a maintenance check flight. They'd fly by itself. But on missions, they would fly a minimum of 2, sometimes a 4-ship, sometimes a 6-ship. That's because there's only one seat in the A-10. When the F-4 Phantom was here, it has 2 cockpits, the pilot in the front and the gib, or as we called it, the guy in the back, or the scope dope, was in the back seat looking at, watching his radar. But his secondary job was to check their 6 at all times to make sure no one's coming up behind him. The A-10 doesn't have that luxury. So they fly in pairs and periodically shift leads to make sure that they can check each other's six to make sure their tail is clear. So once the squadron got the information, the pilots would jump into the pickup truck, get dropped off at their individual airplanes. They do the walk around, kick the missile, wiggle the flap. For some reason, pilots do that. And as we call it, strap on the airplane and take off to their designated wartime locations. So once the airplanes were generated and deployed to our locations in Germany, that was our NATO tasking. Now, I said before that the wing was allocated 120 A-10s. However, when the A-10 came into being, it came with a mission statement, which said, the combat mission of the 81st TAC Fighter Wing was to provide A-10 close air support to our European allies in the NATO theater of operations, which is shown on the map here. The Germans gave us 4 peacetime bases: Alhorn, Norvenich, Sembach, and Leipheim, where I used to go with the 92nd. Each one of those bases was reconfigured to have 8 A-10s at all times in peacetime. And depending on the flying schedule, the airplanes would deploy to the FOL, as we called it, a forward operating location, and for a week or 2 weeks, and then depending on the maintenance schedules and flying schedules, they would come home and another 8 airplanes would go to those FOLs. Quite bluntly, they were the cannon fodder to buy NATO time to spin up the war machine. However, the 4 bases that were shown we didn't have enough space to hold all 6 squadrons. So in the background, in northern Germany and in southern Germany, we built 2 more FOLs that were classified, but we call them bare base locations because that's what it said on the tin. So as the airplanes took off, up on the generation board, as the airplanes departed, all that information was wiped off the board. There's 2 salient points to remember. One, once the airplanes broke ground, they were no longer an 81st asset, they were a NATO asset. And second is, you have to remember that we didn't run the air war, NATO did. We supplied airplanes, and NATO is the ones that gave the taskings to the FOLs. So in the best case scenario, that once the airplanes were generated, our NATO tasking was to flush out those 4 peacetime FOLs from 8 airplanes that were there to the full complement of 20 per each squadron. And that tasking had to be done within 24 hours. That is why all that box ticking in the back is critical to make sure that we met that timing. Now NATO, bless their cotton socks, realized that shipping 12 airplanes to each one of the FOLs and 12 airplanes worth of logistics, people, parts, toilet paper, and pencils, to do that for 20 airplanes to a bare base where there was nothing assigned, there was no trucks, nothing, except a control tower, shelters, and runways, was going to take longer. So NATO gave the 81st TAC Fighter Wing an additional 24 hours to deploy to those 2 classified wartime locations in northern Germany and southern Germany. Now, as I said, NATO ran the air war. So Germany was split into 2, right about there, into north and south, what we call ATAFs, Allied Tactical Air Forces. 2 ATAF was in the north, 4 ATAF was in the south. Their job, as I said, was to give the taskings to the FOLs to go out and attack the tanks on Autobahn B or whatever it happened to be. So all we did was supply airplanes. So after 48 hours, which was our NATO tasking, the best case scenario is those generation boards are blank because all the airplanes have been deployed, and we've got 120 airplanes flying over the Warsaw Pact, taking out Warsaw Pact armor, tanks, half-tracks, and jeeps within the first 2 days. Now that all the aircraft have been assigned to Bentwaters have been generated and deployed to our 6 wartime locations in Germany, the 4 peacetime and 2 classified ones, we went into what we called Phase 3, or STO, Survive to Operate. As soon as people reported to work to start generating the airplanes, they put their battle gear on and carry their chemical suit with them, because as I mentioned at the beginning, we fully expected to be attacked with chemical and or biological weapons throughout the period of the war. Depending on people's specialty and what they were assigned to do, everybody carried a web belt, gas mask, canteens, first aid kits. Other people, depending on what their mission was, would have additional suspenders on, which would carry flashlights, and they might be armed with a .38 caliber pistol, which I was, because I was responsible for 150 M16s to give to our people in the Deputy Commander for Maintenance Center. So we knew from NATO intelligence that the mission of the Warsaw Pact was to make Bentwaters and Woodbridge unusable as a resupply base. That meant that they would, we knew they would attack the runways, they'd attack the taxiways, they'd attack the weapons storage area. And we had to be prepared to do that. And this is important, because this is where the link between the USAF and the RAF became very obvious. As soon as we went into an exercise or contingency after the telephone recall, the Royal Air Force from RAF Watersham had pre-surveyed points around both Bentwaters and Woodbridge, that as soon as we went into an exercise, they would deploy the Rapier missiles and Rapier radar sets to each one of those pre-surveyed points around the bases. Their control center was in a room what we call the Cold War room, but that is where they would set up their consoles and establish communications with all the people at those pre-surveyed points. Their mission was to pick up any of the enemy aircraft or fast movers coming across the North Sea, say from Holland, and prepare to take them out. What's most important, though, is as soon as the radars picked up a potential enemy attack, they radioed into their control center, and they would start doing whatever they did, because we didn't have the clearance to go in there. But the important function was they would notify one of the controllers in the EA cell, which is the room next door to here, telling them that an air attack is imminent. So they would immediately announce through what we call giant voice, which was a set of 4 speakers on large poles on the cardinal points of the compass, announcing alarm red, attack is imminent, don your protective gear and take cover. And that's when we put our gas masks on, put our helmets on, and find a ditch to lay in until the attack was over. Once the attack was over, there were teams that would go out and find out if there was chemical and or biological weapons used, or just conventional. We also had people trained to go out and patch the runway, patch the taxiway. If chemical or biological agents were used, say in the weapons storage area, the wing protocol stipulated we would only decontaminate critical command and control functions, such as the command post, the hospitals, the individual fighter squadrons, and the weapons storage area. I'm sorry, but unfortunately, if the cinema and the Burger King on the other side of the base got contaminated, it stayed that way, because we only decontaminated critical resources. So we would do this for about 3 days, just maintaining the base, keeping the base open, waiting for what we called additive forces or reinforcements. The first unit in as an additive force was the 354th Wing from Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, with 85 A-10s. And we would do the same thing to them that we did to ourselves, with the exception that when the A-10s came over, they would fly over with external fuel tanks, just to be able to get them across the ocean. We would drop those tanks off because you can't fly combat with tanks on. But we would do the same thing to them. We'd track the squadron, the tail number, the pilot's names, and we would tick all the boxes. Throughout the first days of the war, day one, where we had the 4 FOLs filled up, and then day 2 when the classified FOLs were filled up. Throughout the war, each one of the commanders through the NATO chain of command are reporting back to the wing commander saying that when the additive forces do get here, Alhorn needs 12 airframes, Simbach needs 2 airframes, Leipheim needs 14 airplanes. How long is a piece of string? So once the requisite number of A-10s from Myrtle Beach have landed here and been regenerated, they would take off en masse to all 6 FOLs to bring the NATO contingent back up to 120, which is started with by day 1 and day 2. We fully expected that the FOLs would be overrun by day 2, which meant that we would then have to decamp from the FOL and move out to the Autobahns. And we would use the Autobahns as runways. So the airplanes would land on the Autobahn, we fuel it, load it, and it'd taxi out and use the Autobahn as a runway. For the first 5 days, what we were doing, we were trading territory for time, backing up, giving NATO time to spin up the war machine. So once the additive force, once Myrtle Beach got here, after they resupplied the 6 FOLs, it was a 1-for-1 swap. The shelters and the infrastructure at the FOLs was the same as the shelters and the infrastructure that's back here. The NATO 3rd generation shelters, they only hold 2 airplanes. You don't want to shelter a broke airplane for 3 days while you're waiting for a wingtip to come in, or whatever it happened to be, when you could be sheltering a good airplane that can go out and drop bombs and kill people. So the pilots are told, if you're too badly damaged, don't even attempt to go back to the FOL, the forward operating location you came from, because there's no repair capability for that. Try and make it back to Bentwaters Woodbridge, where we had the back shops and the heavy maintenance repair capability. It's what we call a forward employment, rearward maintenance concept. We deployed forward with bunches and bunches and bunches of pallets and containers full of spare parts. So it was just changing a spare part, the airplane's back in the air, the spare part makes its way back to Bentwaters to be fixed, to go back into the supply chain. And all the heavy maintenance was done out here. So if the pilot couldn't make it all the way, due for whatever the fault of the airplane is, they were recommended to do what we call the nylon approach and take out and punch out, and then we would send another airplane. Once the remaining pool of Myrtle Beach airplanes got down into the low 20s, high teens, the next unit in was Davis-Monthan Air Force Base, Arizona, with 95 A-10s, and we do the same thing to them. Just keep drip feeding the A-10s into Europe. And once Davis-Monthan was almost expired, then it was Moody, Georgia, with 85 A-10s, then McCord, Washington. Richard Gebauer Air National Guard, for some reason, had 10 airplanes. I don't know how they got in there, but they contributed. And it was just a matter of drip feeding the A-10s from here and Woodbridge into the battle zone within the first 5 days and further on. The concept of operation was, as we were trading territory for time and building up our forces, once we hit day 5 and the additive forces here, then we start pushing back, pushing the enemy forces of the Warsaw Pact back to the line of demarcation, negotiate cessation of hostilities without going strategically nuclear. Because once you start slinging ICBMs, as we know, all bets are off. And that, in a long-winded scenario, is what we did here at the 81st TAC Fighter Wing, and how the command post, which is now the Bentwaters Cold War Museum, played a part in that critical function. We've talked about what happens in the command post during the building up to the Third World War. We learned a lot, we meaning the Americans, learned a lot from history. During the Vietnam War, we didn't really have any ground support aircraft. We had a couple of helicopters and things, but nothing dedicated to ground support. So when we got involved in a firefight, we would call in the F-4s, and they would come in, drop their napalm or whatever, or fire their rockets. but they were traveling at 400 miles an hour, and their area of coverage wasn't great. So the planners realized that in the event of a Third World War, that concept wasn't going to work. And that's why they came up with the idea that along the IGB, the inner German border, that is where there were thousands, not hundreds, but thousands of Soviet T-72 tanks waiting to come across the border. So the Air Force put out a tender to build some type of support aircraft, and Fairchild Republic built the A-10, and the other one, I forget, I think it was Boeing, but I apologize if that's wrong. They had a fly off, and the Air Force bought the A-10A, which was the first one of the models. It was designed for the European conflict. It's designed to take a fair amount of battle damage, be relatively easy to fix, and be able to get back in the air. I spoke about prior what we had is what we call a forward employment rearward maintenance. So we would deploy from Bentwaters to our 4 peacetime locations and 2 classified locations with containers and pallets full of equipment. And as the airplanes were flying and they were getting shot down or damaged, if we could fix them at the FOLs, we could. Otherwise, they were told to fly back to Bentwaters and try to get there for heavy maintenance. The main armament of the gun is the 30 millimeter GAU-8A Avenger, made by General Electric, if I believe, and each airplane carries 1,170 rounds of 30 millimeter, either API, which is armor piercing incendiary, or HEI, which is high explosive incendiary. The gun fires on high speed 4,200 rounds a minute. So if you do the math, that's 70 rounds per second coming out of the front end of the GAU-8 gun. And that was designed to be able to decimate Soviet armor, tanks, half-tracks, whatever. By setting up the FOLs and putting 8 airplanes at each FOL, as I said before, they were basically the cannon fodder to buy NATO time to spin up the war machine. So when the generation happened and we shipped the remaining airplanes, and we got 120 A-10s in the field, launching from Leipheim into what we call the FIBA, the forward edge of the battle area, was about 15-20 minutes thereabout. So the A-10s could go, and they were designed to loiter over the battlefield and take out either planned targets of opportunity, or cries for help. And so they would just fly around in their, what they call AOR, area of responsibility. When they were either running out low on fuel or low on ammo, back to Leipheim, which is where the 92nd was, rearm, reload, and then back into the FIBA again. Instead of an hour and 10 minutes flight to Leipheim, get gas, go into the battle for 45 minutes, get gas again, hour and 10 minutes back to Bentwaters to rearm and reload. Quite honestly, that was dumber than a box of rocks. So that's why we had the 6 FOLs there, being right on the what we call the IGB, the inner German border. The airplane was designed to be easy to fix, relatively easy to maintain, and get it back in the air, because the airplane doesn't do us any good when it's sitting on the ground. Like I said, it's got the GAU-8 gun, Avenger gun, which is basically the airplane was built around the airplane. When you look at the airplane nose on, you'll see that the nose landing gear is offset, because the barrels of the GAU-8 are 8 foot long. They come to about here. And in the 8 foot long barrels, they're rifled cast iron, and they're good for 3,000 rounds until they had to be changed, because the heat of the explosion of the shell would warp the cast iron. So at the end of the barrels is what we call the gun drum. And all it is a container, It's a container like this that has a giant helicoil inside, and that's where the 1,170 rounds were loaded. As the pilot expended the ammunition, unlike the films from World War II, you see B-17s, B-24s, the guys in the back shooting, and casings are flying everywhere. The only bit that leaves the airplane is the blue bit. The casing stays inside and comes back into the gun drum. The Galway gun is a Gatling gun, just like we have in the Westerns. You pull the trigger, it fires the gun, rotates, another shell goes in, the empty casing comes back and goes into the gun drum. Therefore, when we have to reload the airplane, it's relatively simple. Undo the latches, drop the empty drum, put a full drum up, connect the latches, and he's back in the air in half an hour or thereabouts. The other design features to make the pilot safe and to give more combat ability to the airplane was the pilot sits in a titanium bathtub, and everything is rated up to a 23 millimeter, which was at that point in time the Soviet ZSU-4 stroke 2 or stroke 4, which is 4 barrels of 23 millimeter shooting at the A-10. Well, that bathtub was designed to just let them bounce off. The airplane wings are filled with foam as well as fuel. So unlike, again, World War II, when a wing was shot off, because there was fuel and oxygen in there, the wing would explode, the airplane would spiral down and kill the crew. With the A-10, when the shell penetrates it, it doesn't stop the leak, slows it down, but the big thing is because there's little oxygen in there, the wing stays on and gives the airplane a chance to get home. The TF-34-100 high bypass turbofan engines were designed uniquely for the A-10. It's what they call a turbofan engine, where the fan in the front is freewheeling. It's not geared to anything. The compressor is right about here. So when the pilot starts the engine and the compressor starts to spin, it sucks air into the intake, and the hot exhaust comes out. Now, with the high bypass turbofan engine, you can see the hot exhaust comes out of the black bit, but there's an opening here where all this cool air that's being brought in creates a shroud or a barrier to any heat-seeking missile. So by the time the exhaust gets to the end, the exhaust is cool enough where a SA-9, SA-7 shoulder-launched heat-seeking missile won't lock onto it. And again, that gave the ability for the airplane to have a better survivability rate over the combat area. And the final main design function was the landing gear. Normally, when a pilot lands the airplane, they slap the handle down and you land the airplane, and the pilot gets out and goes to the club and has a beer. If that doesn't work, the alternate is to blow the gear down, where you pull the handle out and there's a cap of 3,000 psi of nitrogen on each strut, which unlocks the gear. And on the back, of course, this model doesn't have it, there's fairings that act like sails, and the wind blowing forward blows the gear down, locks it in place. He lands, goes to the club and have a beer. If that fails in any other airplane, you're dead. However, with the A-10 being designed the way it is, even when the gear is up, it still rotates in the main wheel well. So all the pilot has to do is find a straight piece of concrete or audron and land. The wheels will roll in the wheel well as it goes down. The gun makes the airplane nose heavy, so that will just dig into the concrete and stop the airplane. Jack the airplane up, fix whatever the problem was, put a new gun in, he's back in the air in less than a day. The airplane was designed to be able to take hits and still be survivable. And that's why the U.S. Air Force sent out the design, because they realized that once the Soviet Union crossed the IGB with their thousands of T-72 tanks, which then was the premier tank, we needed something that could slow the Warsaw Pact down as we traded territory for time backing up. And that's why the Air Force bought 750 A-10s. Currently, in 2023, there's about 280 still flying in different units they're in the National Guard, active duty units, or reserve units. The rest have either been disposed of or they're sitting out at Davis Mountain, Arizona in the boneyard, and they could be reconstituted if need be. So that's a quick potted history of the Bentwaters Cold War Museum. Prior to that, it was the 81st Tank Fighter Wing Command Post, and some details about the A-10 that made it such a wonderful airplane to work on, and the pilots loved it, and the maintenance people loved it as well. Thank you for your time.